They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And I know, Katie, we are really excited today to welcome in our next guest. She's pretty darn amazing, and she does it all with 6 kids. So I told her before we started, she gets the honorary nap award of the day because she probably needs it. But Joy Pullmann is here. She is the executive editor at the Federalist, which is a publication I know we both check in with all the time. She's also the author of a book called False Flag, Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. You can give her a follow at Joy Pullmann, 2 L's, 2 N's. Joy, thanks so much for being with us on the Happy Women Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I love the title of this podcast.
We try. And I say I live in California and Katie lives in DC or in Virginia. So we're the mostly Happy Women podcast. Sometimes politics get in the way. You have to have an optimistic attitude. That's for sure. So before we jump in, we really like to find out where our guests kind of come from and how you end up where you are today. So tell us a little bit about your story and how you're here writing books, writing for the Federalist and really doing it all.
Well, I think I'll try to give the short version. I grew up on the family farm in Wisconsin, as you can probably hear from my voice. Not quite Minnesota, but definitely I don't do the Wisconsin thing, but people will talk about that all the time. So actually, my dad became an organic farmer way before it was cool. I went from the family farm to Hillsdale College, where I met my husband. And then after that, we moved to DC, and I worked for the American Enterprise Institute for a number of years. Then I moved to the Heartland Institute to run their education newspaper. And from that, I moved over to the Federalist, where I was their first hire. And I'm still here 10 years later. Very happy, love my colleagues and our work environment. And along the way, my husband and I had 6 children in 9 years. I calculated that I spent until my youngest child, who is now 4, miraculously, there's currently no more baby, although that could change at any time. I calculated for my husband before our youngest child that I had been nursing for 12 years straight, or nursing or pregnant, or sometimes both, which is anybody who's done those things, you'll realize just how nuts that is. While also, I mean, I've cycled through both part-time and full-time. My husband went to grad school in there, and we also started a classical school for our children. So it's been a very busy life, and I am indeed in need of a nap.
Wow. So that was one of the questions I was going to ask you is, first of all, are you still actually living in DC? And if so, how do you survive? But my second question is, what do you do about educating your kids?
Yeah. So no, we left DC soon after we started a family. My husband grew up in Montana, and we really did not want to raise our children in the DC environment. And so now about 10 years later, that was a good decision in retrospect. So we're glad we did that. We moved back to the Midwest. So actually while working at the Heartland Institute, I was one of the first, and I would say most tenacious people reporting on the Common Core topic before it got really noticed by, large publications. And I actually wrote my first conventional book was published about that with Encounter. And so from that experience, really, that gave me actually, I think, a leg up into coming into the Trump presidency, because I had watched this grassroots movement be completely quashed by the Republican Party. And so understanding that, really the resentment and the distrust of party leaders, among the American people, the voters, and these sort of issues that really divide that unite Americans across alleged party lines. That was Common Core is also a clue into that. There's many, many more issues, as I'm sure you're aware, that are like that. But as a result of that very close experience reporting on the disgusting that is the nation's public school system, my husband and I really felt that we had to get our kids a good education, and our way of answering that was to start a school for them. So my husband went back to grad school at Hillsdale College to prepare for being a headmaster. And so while I was joining a startup media company, we were running our own nonprofit startup and having our family startup at the same time. So it's been quite something.
Wow. So how many students does the school have now?
So we started with one class of students, 5, and I think we are 7 years later. And so now we're more than 10 times, almost 11 times that many. That actually the kids just started their first day of school today. We have the traditional Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day weekend start and stop time. So we have a very long, very nice summer for the children. But once they get back to school, they work very hard too.
I love that. This whole back to school in August nonsense, when I was going through private school, it was always the day after Labor Day. So I do appreciate that for sure. And also, we share a little something in common because my dad's family, farmers in Sharon, Wisconsin. So definitely know that life. And I think as we get into talking more about the election, I do think it's really an interesting study. I know a lot of people love to focus on Pennsylvania, but I really believe that Wisconsin also is very telling about where this election is going to go. So maybe we can get there in just a moment. But first, love to hear about your book, which is False Flag: Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. What was the catalyst for this book? I mean, obviously, it's been some of the news stories. We just lived through the Olympics. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy things that are happening. But what made you think you wanted to sit down and write this book in long form?
Well, I would say 2 or maybe 3 main reasons. The first one actually is just that the publisher had been after me, Regnery. I went with Regnery this time, and they've been after me for a while to write a book. And they saw I wrote an essay for the Federalist, basically, and they on the topic, and they asked me to write it. And I I don't bully my husband, but I negotiated with him and showed him that I could fit it into our schedule. And then he agreed that, okay, fine, as long as it doesn't stress you out. So that was the first reason, just because I was asked. But the second one, actually, I decided to take the project just partly because I know that people are scared to talk about the issue, and there's safer ways that people will talk about the issue that really don't get to the root of it. So, for example, the women's sports, sort of only talking about the effect of transgenderism on women's sports without talking about, for example, its origins in feminism, right? Because we have a really feminist society, and people really don't want to challenge those assumptions, right? Because then people would have to do some self-criticism, and that's very difficult. And there's other people don't want to get into it because it can be emotionally difficult. You may have, most people have a friend's family member who's somehow related to the LGBT rainbow in some way. And we all love, we love those people. We don't want to alienate and hurt their feelings. So that's another thing. So I just felt I was in a position to be able to speak boldly on this issue so many people are scared to talk about. And the third reason is why I found that really necessary to do is because, there's a lot more under the surface here than just gender issues, right? It's a lot more going on than changing rooms and bathrooms and men punching women in boxing rings. There's some very, very dark things. So, for example, one of the things I suspected this just because I'm, as I work at the Federalist, I do a lot of media criticism, and so I'm a pattern seer. So I suspected this, but then I researched it and found out it was true. Some of the main queer theorists are actually pro-pedophilia. We've been told for years that that's not true. If you say that, you're a bigot. But Michel Foucault, one of the top queer theorists and postmodern theorists, he actually, moms, and please cover your kids' ears. I'm going to try to be PG about this, but let's just say he abused little boys. Personally, advocated for erasing the age of consent laws in Europe and other things like that. That's just one example. I go through a couple of others, but I just think of it in terms of why would we ever be getting any ideas from people that disgusting and depraved, right? And he is a major influence on the modern academy, right? And so I think most normal people are not aware of these things. They're not allowed to say these things. And I'm aware and I'm not afraid. And so here's this book.
I have to say, I love your book. I was really excited to read it. As you may know, Mike Gonzalez and I wrote something a little bit similar, but with a broader focus. Our book is Next Gen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It. And I have to say, one of the most interesting chapters for me to research and to write was about the sexual revolution. And you said something in your book that just so stood out for me. You had this great line where you said, leading feminists projected their own family chaos onto politics. I thought that was brilliant. And one of the things that reminded me of was what I found in doing the research about, like, why have we ended up that transgenderism is the heart of the culture war today? And what I realized was that basically along similar lines to what you said, but I found that all socialist utopians, going back to Rousseau, going to Robert Owen, going to Karl Marx, ending up with Foucault, they all projected their own sexual deviancy onto their worldview. And my argument is that I'm utterly convinced of this. They created the sort of the worldviews, the philosophies that they did as a way to justify and make room for their own sexual proclivities. And, one of the problems is we think of Marxism or socialism as just an economic system, but they really wanted to destroy everything. And I thought you really sort of dove into that in such a powerful way.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's one of the things I always think about, right? Because there's this, and on the right, for as long as I've been alive, there's been this alleged divide between economics and social issues, and the economic issues are the safe ones that the Republicans want to talk about, and the social issues are the icky ones that only those yucky, bigoted people talk about. But I mean, just if that doesn't resonate with any normal person's experience at all, right? Because especially with most of my career having focused on education, you realize that human beings are not primarily economic actors. They are spiritual actors, and the morals and the behavior and the standards and the way of life that people have absolutely affects their economic outcomes. We've always acted like the main focus should be on what really is kind of a downstream effect of family and culture. If you don't have the family in order, you have a dysfunctional culture. So I think people looking around at why it's obvious to anyone paying attention that our society is a complete mess. Instead of thinking we can push some economic policy to solve that, I really think that we need to be talking about what's happening in our homes, the lack of happiness that people have, and that's directly related. As the second half of my book, I really think of it as showing how, like what you mentioned here about the Marxists, for example, a lot of this ideology, this what people call woke or Marxism or whatever, it is direct reflection of and an attempt to create dysfunctional chaos inside people's homes and inside their psychology and their spiritual lives. And so, all of this is completely interrelated. Human beings are not widgets. And if children are being, in kindergarten taught by a guy with fake breasts, it's going to affect them for the rest of their lives, including on whether they will be productive and paying taxes. But that should be, honestly, the last thing that we really are thinking about or caring about when you have a situation of, a dude in a dress in front of a kindergartner.
It is such an effort. And I think you kind of we both, Katie and I just saw the Reagan movie over the weekend. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, probably with all your kids, maybe not, but I know you will love it. And
we were away this weekend.
His attempt to dismantle, he saw communism coming. This is such a Marxist effort to separate us away from our faith and then to undermine our family structure as well. And this is what is behind that ultimately? What is the end goal? What do you think that these actors are doing? Because I think for a while, many just normal people were kind of asleep at the switch. But I do think when you start to push so hard and you start to attack our kids, that's when people start to wake up. And I see that even in my state of California, where it's been a slow process to get people fully paying attention. But it is starting to happen. And you've got people now involved with school boards and doing their own homeschooling and taking more control away from the government, from these people who are using the government to overreach into our families. So what do you think ultimately is the end goal here? And do you feel that people are feeling more free to speak up about it?
I mean, as I write in the book, the ultimate end goal is to make people right for totalitarianism. And you do that by making them isolated and lonely, right? So people who are isolated from their own families, and as I talk about in transgenderism, they're isolated from their own bodies, right? Their own selves are, splitting in two. And I even talk in the book about how now, people talk about multiple personality disorder as actually, different personalities within their head have different sexes, different different sexual attractions, so we are way through the looking glass now. But the point being that exemplifies a division of people from each other and from their very own selves. And I think also from God. When you isolate and separate people and when they don't have their natural connections to themselves, to their families, to God, then they quite frankly, slowly or quickly, in some people's cases, become crazy, right? And not only with that, when you isolate people, then they seek for what they should have naturally provided through the communities, through their families, through their friendships. You still have those needs. It's not like they go away just because you don't have friends or a family. And so the only remaining entity, once all the other mitigating institutions have been stripped away, is the government. So people who do not have a family to provide for their needs of friendship, of comfort, of, when you have a baby, people might bring you meals. They might come and watch your other kids. They might do your laundry for you. If you don't have any of that because you don't have a family, you don't know your neighbors, you're not involved with the church, then of course you still have those needs. It's not like you're suddenly able to do all of these things on your own, even though all your support networks have been stripped away. So that creates a demand for bigger government. So the end goal really is to take away everything that privately supplies human needs and happiness, and privately supplies the friendship, the relationship that gives people real, deep, enduring satisfaction, and to replace it with big daddy, big mommy through the government. And I actually write in the book, there's also a spiritual dimension to this as well. There is the deification of government. And that actually, as I'm sure that Katie is aware, that was the original progressives' goal. The Woodrow Wilson progressives in the United States, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they explicitly were trying to detach Americans from the constitutional understanding of natural rights created by God that the government must recognize. It doesn't give them to us. But they said there is no God, so you can't get rights from that God. And so what's the only other institution that can come up with rights? It's the government. And so from that philosophy, to erase the recognition of the laws that God created, such as that men and women are different, that humans are born with natural rights. The progressives have, for the last century or so, really worked to replace the place of God in defining what is a human, what is a man, what is a woman, what is natural, what is, what is due to people just based on right reason alone, the founders would have said, to replace that with government. So I have in my last chat, I think it's the second or maybe third to last chapter, talks about how queer activists are actually starting to be spiritually awakened about that and saying that they are adherents of Lucifer, of Satan. And that's why you see some satanic messaging, transgender activists saying, we are on the side of Satan against God. It's because there's a tie-in between that and replacing God as the author of our rights and saying, no, we want to make government the one that decides what all the rights are, and also the one that therefore can tell you have to say that a woman is a man. You have to say 2 + 2 = 5. That's what makes government totalitarian in the end. It's replacing God with government, which is fallen people.
So I want to make sure that we have time to get to some of your recent articles, particularly the one about Tim Walz saying that Christians cannot teach in schools starting in 2025. But before we turn to that, there's so much here to talk about, but okay. One element that I would love to just delve into just a tiny bit is I just worry, how do we put the genie back in the bottle? Okay. So one of the things that I have seen is, first of all, I think literature plays a huge role in shaping the culture. Literature, films, anything cultural, plays a really important role. So, and I was always a big reader, as is Jen. So I always saw in books, in literature, how they made a big issue about women who, let's say, transgressed, right? They weren't virgins when they were married. And so they were penalized and ostracized. And, or if you got pregnant outside of marriage, what would happen to you? And so I think a lot of women, I would say by far the vast majority of women, embrace sexual freedom because they see that it kind of frees them from the bad reputation, from the being ostracized socially. But I feel like we hardly ever have any discussion about the cost to women of the sexual revolution. And it's a cost to the culture because of the way, as you so brilliantly describe it, the cost to our children and what that is doing to our culture. But I think there's also a big case to be made about the cost to women of the sexual revolution. How do you think we're going to turn it back? Do you think that this is a topic that we can bring up? Do you think that this is something, do you see openness amongst women that you know to sort of reconsidering the sexual revolution? Volatility and uncertainty are everywhere we turn. Many Americans have grown increasingly tired of the reckless fiscal spending, mounting national debt, and the looming threat to the dollar. With never-ending political and global conflicts, Americans are looking for a way out of the fragile paper system and craving a trustworthy asset to help protect their savings. That's why they turn to gold, specifically a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. If you have over $100,000 in a retirement account, it's time you learned about the potential benefits of a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. Augusta Precious Metals is a world-class organization that prides itself on top-notch service. Ready to learn more? Get your free guide on gold IRAs today by calling 855-222-6994. Volatility is everywhere. Now is the time to take control of your retirement to secure a brighter financial future with Augusta Precious Metals. Call them at 855-222-6994 today.
I think there is openness among some women, and that absolutely women really understand that it really stinks to be just groped by random strangers. Women really have to get drunk to do that, right? We don't like it. I don't know about you. I don't like to be, I thankfully have almost never had that happen in my life, right? But it doesn't feel good. No woman really looks forward to that, right? So women have to be on something typically to engage in those experiences, and they regret them afterward, right? And I think any woman, regardless of how she's been taught to label that experience, if you just describe it in that way, 99% of women are going to say, yeah, I don't want to be groped by a random stranger. Right. And then you can, I think that there's a lot of women open to conversations if you put it in terms that, they can understand and think through. And then you think and there actually has been a little bit of writing done by this, even, by women on the right. I forget, I believe it was an Atlantic or New York Times writer a couple of years ago who was looking at the effects of the sexual revolution on young women, making them snap naked pictures of themselves and put it on social media at age 14. The fact that they would have to get drunk to go to parties, this isn't really attractive. And the girls would talk about how they don't like it, right? Obviously, it sounds horrible, totally horrible. So I think that people across the political spectrum are open to that, but they have also been inoculated with a lot of just stupid pablum, like, you're repressing stuff. I'm not being repressed. I think it's more liberating to not be essentially raped while drunk than it would be to be raped while drunk, right? So it can be difficult because of the slogans that have been stuffed into women's minds. But if you can take away the slogan and just talk about the facts underneath, women are, I do think they're absolutely open to that. And also, women, especially, I think Zoomers, they've watched the excesses of the millennial generation, which I'm a part of. I think the millennials have bought into the, kind of boomer lifestyle and thinking about the sexual revolution. It clearly hasn't gone super well. Like, I even write about in my book, for example, the singer Billie Eilish, she talks about the fact that exposure to pornography actually made her wear baggy clothing, right? And there's just young women more aware of that, and possibly, but the pornification of the culture is disgusting and revulsive to women. And I actually think part of that plays into some of the growth in the asexual sort of self-description, because a 14-year-old, 16-year-old, 18-year-old girl looking at porn and saying, if this is what sex is, I don't want it. I think that's a healthy reaction. They just don't know that there's, actually delightful other alternative options to them, because no one is showing them, what healthy love and relationships between the sexes look like. That's where I think the opportunity is everything in our culture has gotten to such a level of filth that something that is actually beautiful and actually wholesome is very attractive. Some of the biggest YouTube channels, for example, I don't don't know if you've seen any of these, but they're of like women making sourdough bread and cutting flowers, from their fields that they've grown and tending to their, little sheep or whatever, and I actually, an acquaintance of mine, I was putting out a channel like that. And so I looked at it and I thought, I could just stand in my own kitchen and quietly pour myself a cup of tea instead of watching someone else do the same thing. But the point is, people are attracted to that. There's a deep human longing. I do think that human nature, I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, always gallops back. And so that people on the right can and should be speaking to that desire for wholeness, desire for true love, for not being treated like sex objects and being objectified and brutalized, and introduce to people, what healthy sex life and admiration and love between the sexes can be. That the field is wide open there. It's the filthiness of our culture is actually also a big opportunity to reach people with something that is so much better. And it's actually not hard given the alternative that's available.
I think you're onto it, Joy. I think that the youngest generation, the teenagers right now, there is a huge flip, both politically and I think romantically. And I think it goes back to what we've been talking about. And that is this idea, you always have these women that say, I'm just going to do me. There's nobody that's thinking about other people. And I think when you start having people get this backlash to start focusing on other people as well as themselves, I think you start to see some healthy repairs in our culture, especially when it comes to romance. But we've got to jump into some of these articles. Tim Walz, of course, is the wannabe vice presidential candidate. He's got an interesting record, even his own brother coming out saying, I wouldn't trust this guy to make decisions for the country. That can't be good. But you have a piece of the Federalist about one of his policies in Minnesota, which is preventing Christians from teaching in public schools. Tell us about this, because this seems pretty wild.
It sounds crazy to me. I actually had to check that headline with several sources just to make sure I wasn't over my skis, but it is the plain truth. So Tim Walz's appointees on the state licensing board passed these rules, and I quote them in the article, and so I will paraphrase, and generously quote them here, but you can look, up my article to get the exact phrasing. But it does require that teachers to be licensed in Minnesota going forward must affirm and support. Among other things, of course, there's all the race Marxism and all the rest of that, but they also have to affirm and support transgender, gender identity, and so forth, and demonstrate that will be supported and affirmed in their classrooms. So you cannot teach in a public school without having a teaching license, right? There are sometimes exceptions. If there is an urgent need, you can get hired, but then you have to work on the teaching license. 99% of teachers got to get that license in order to work in a public school. So by requiring, which is clearly a First Amendment violation, right? You're forcing people to stand up and affirm something that they know is false, right? That they know it is false, that your gender identity, cannot be something other than the sex you were born, right? That is something. So I put Christians in the headline because that's the majority population of Minnesota that would be affected by this. And it shows, I think, how directly bigoted it is. But also, of course, it would be a problem for Jews, Muslims, to mention other world major religions that also affirm that men and women are different. And also people who are atheists or agnostics who also know that men and women are different, right? This is a First Amendment violation for all of them to force them to publicly testify against what their consciences believe to be true. And it's not just their conscience, of course, but actual factual reality. The other surprising thing about the story, besides that crazy fact, is that in Minnesota, the law, that regulation ought to be immediately challenged in court. It is on face unconstitutional. The pro First Amendment, pro religious liberties, nonprofit law firms who will pay for almost all of the litigation themselves, undertake it personally, funded by their donors. They cannot sue because they can't find a plaintiff in Minnesota. The Christian colleges who would have to teach these education, I don't like to call them standards, right? These education abominations would have to, teach falsify their own faith, teach their own students to deny their own religion in public. There's numerous Christian universities in Minnesota that fit the caliber. They've been approached by these lawyers, and I've talked to several people who are literally in on meetings with these universities, and they don't want to file the litigation partly because their education professors support transgenderism and forcing teachers to affirm it. But so there's some that are just plain non-Christian believers who are hired by those schools. And the other ones are frankly cowards. They say, well, we can't really believe that the state will enforce what they're really saying. So they've refused to become plaintiffs in cases, in a case against these requirements, which means that they will continue to stand and be enforced on teachers until someone challenges them. It's both appalling that the state would do this, and that there's not one Christian teaching student or college or institution in the state of Minnesota that would stand up and challenge it.
So I think it's so important that you were able to highlight this policy for people as they look at Walz, because I tell you what, the mainstream media is not going to do it. So I just would love to talk a little bit about the Federalist. I've been a big fan of the Federalist for years. Everybody talks about the dominance of the mainstream media. There's a big part of me that says I don't even think we should call them the mainstream media anymore, because I don't think they are the mainstream. I think they've marginalized themselves. And I also think they're all losing their audience. I'd love to hear a little bit. Do you see cause for optimism in the trajectory of the Federalist? Are you optimistic? Are you struggling up against being silenced by social media? Is it a good picture or a bad picture?
Well, I think both. I mean, you are right. I mean, they're not mainstream. No one should use that term. They are extremists, right? People who are pushing, abortion, killing a baby until its head is out of the birth canal. Those are completely extremist and out of step with the vast majority of America. As we've seen with the recent abortion news cycle, that's where this, the media is. And you're right. The numbers show them hemorrhaging viewers. NPR, CNN, all of them down the viewers. And then you see, programs like Tucker Carlson on X easily beating, number of Rumble streams, Louder with Crowder, right? Steven Crowder, way bigger than the vast majority of even the biggest cable news shows, right? So people are very hungry for the alternative media, and I do see that as a good sign. But but you're right. The censorship is very fierce, and it's powered by AI now, so it's very quick. So the Federalist, I guess the last thing I'll say on that is because of the censorship, really affecting our operations, our ability to reach people who want to hear our message. The Federalist is engaged in a lawsuit against the U.S. State Department for funding censorship tools that are being used not only against us. We're in the lawsuit with the Daily Wire and the state of Texas as well. So as I'm sure you're aware, there's a number of other lawsuits. But, based on that, of course, everyone probably should be aware of the Murthy v. Missouri lawsuit that's back in the Fifth Circuit currently. That is an existential issue for right media. Anybody who wants to hear alternative views. The recent jailing of the Telegram app creator, Pavel. Taking down. Thank you, Durham. The taking down of X in Brazil. These are things that they happened in France and Brazil, but they absolutely were. There's no way it could have happened without the United States at least giving tacit approval to that. So that means that the United States officials, they agree with that sort of censorship behavior. What if in these ways of reaching around people were shut down inside the United States? It is not. I think people should expect that would be the case, especially if we have Democrats. When we have, Katie, your husband, we've got journalists in jail. Just like the Obama administration, the Biden-Harris. I like that Freudian slip there because everyone's aware that Obama's pulling the strings, behind the Biden-Harris campaign, but they're jailing journalists, right? So it's only going to continue. And Americans need to be not only very worried about that, but putting pressure on their representatives to solve this issue quickly by whatever means possible. And just holding hearings and shouting at the television cameras is not enough.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. And I think these publications like the Federalist, you really have to seek them out because they will, because of big tech, be taken from you. So you've got to look for them. The Federalist is a great spot. I use it, I know, for my radio show. Katie, I know you check in with it as well. And Joy, we really appreciate what you're doing. You're welcome back anytime. It's been a joy to talk to you. Joy Pullmann has been here. You can give her a follow at Joy Pullmann. That's 2 L's and 2 N's. She's the executive editor at the Federalist. She also has a book out, which you should check out, False Flag: Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. And Joy, thanks so much for spending some time with us here today.
Thanks for having me, ladies.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us. We want you to follow us on social media as well. You can find Katie. Well, first of all, you got to get her book. It's called Next Gen Marxism. It's available wherever you get your books. You can check her out online as well, katiegorka.org. You can also check her out on Facebook and on all the social media platforms. Facebook, search for Catherine Gorka, on X, Gorka Katie. And you can find me as well, Instagram and Facebook, Jennifer Horn Radio, and on X and Truth Social at Jennifer Horn. Thank you so much for being with us. Please, if you can, share the podcast with your friends. Give us those 5-star reviews. We always appreciate them. And you can connect with us on all the platforms at SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Thanks for joining us. This is another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.